Gluten Targan everybody. Okay, we're 2 campaigns deep into this No Ring challenge, so of course we're going to attempt Team Rose today. And rather than starting on the stage select screen, we're going to start here, simply because Team Rose has to play Seagate as part of their campaign. Now, of course, I'm not playing through this as a campaign, I'm just going through stage select to make my life easier. But for the sake of loading a save state, for the sake of this video, I'll be playing through Team Rose at the start as a campaign just to play through Seagate, and then we'll be going back to how it was. So off we go with the most obnoxious tutorial in video game history, Seagate. The level itself, as you can guess, no issues absolutely anywhere. There's a very scarce amount of rings in the stage, all things considered. However, there is one big problem, and that is Big himself, because he's a fucking unit. Look at the size of him. When we get to this one tunnel later on in the stage, you have to destroy it open using Big's power attacks, and if you so much as do a belly flop or you send the characters through the tunnel, they're going to pick rings up. So we had to try and find a way to maneuver this tunnel without picking up rings, and we couldn't use Cream because for whatever reason the hit collision goes really dodgy when we start to use Cream's formation in Team Rose's story, simply because Big is that huge, his collision is rubbing off of every wall left, right and centre, so we can't exactly make precise manoeuvres using flight formation this time around, and that's a problem. So instead we have to make our manoeuvres using Big and his version of Knuckles' boxing gloves. Every power character in this game has a different type of, let's call it an idle power mode, where you can get your characters ready to attack, but you haven't actually sent them out to attack yet. Knuckles uses its boxing gloves, as well as Omega. Vector and Big put their characters on their shoulders or in their mouth respectively, and then we'll go ahead and use them as fireballs. So in relation to this tunnel, we're going to have to get our characters on Big's shoulders and then walk through it very slowly, but the issue is we still have to break open the ruins, and when we try and do this, they get sent into rings, and I tried this for a long time, and the fewest amount of rings I got out with was 2 rings. So off the bat, if we're going to count Seagate is impossible without collecting a ring, and therefore Team Rose's story is already impossible without collecting a ring. What a start. We finished Seagate with 2 rings. Now we can get back to the main game, Seaside Hill. Now, I was also annoyed at the start of this stage, much like Team Dark, as we are forced to collect some rings. However, it's not as bad as it was with Team Dark because we get control over the team as we hit the second ring, and even though it's still bad to start with 2 instead of 0, I guess it's not 4 like the game wants it to be, so we can at least skate around the rings. But later on in the stage we get to the bobsleigh section, and of course we are forced to collect rings here as well, with it being easy mode and whatnot. There's a line of 3 ring bubbles, and each of them contain a different value of rings, so it took about 2 attempts to find the one with the least, which was 5. The rest of the stage goes on as normal, not a problem, and we finished the stage with 7 rings, which, for the first 2 stages, 9 rings, it felt like a bad omen and a sign of things to come. Thankfully, Ocean Palace decided to take a break from giving us mandatory rings, and lets us explore a little bit. The whole stage, I kid you not, is almost identical to that of every other story we've played so far, apart from there are less rings, believe it or not, and it was not a problem whatsoever. Apart from when we got to the turtles at the end, it took a couple of regos to figure out which formation to enter the cannon as so that we didn't get launched into ring bubbles, but beside that, Ocean Palace was an absolute breeze, and we finish it with 0 rings. The same can be said about Egghawk. Of course, this is going to be a repetitive thing I'm going to end up saying now, but Egghawk, again, you just jump away from the rings at the start, and you go and chase the machine, take it to the middle, and absolutely wail on it, and have it finished in literally less than a minute. 0 rings. Happy days. Grand Metropolis was one of the easiest levels in this run to collect 0 rings on. The stage itself is modelled very similar to that of the other stories, however, there are again less rings, and of course with the stage being cut in almost more than half, there's absolutely no chances to pick up rings in areas that might be considered difficult. The only slightly tricky part was just before the goal ring, but that's just because of the size of Big the Cat once again. But we finished this one again without any problems and with 0 rings. Same applies to Power Plant. Not only does this one not have as many scripted sequences or as many rings in areas that are difficult to see, it's mainly just destroy the enemy and move forward, and that's exactly what we did, getting us to the end of the stage without a problem at all. Power Plant is finished with 0 rings. Now this is where I expected us to pick up our mandatory ring for each section, and to my surprise, Team Rose starts this boss fight without picking a ring up. This happened in Team Dark story as well. For whatever reason, Team Sonic is the only team in these fights to pick a ring up on start. If you fight Team Sonic, you're not picking a ring up. If you fight Team Chaotix, you are picking a ring up. It's quite interesting how these characters' spawns alter depending on who they fight, But I'm not going to complain because we finished this fight with 0 rings and 0 shots fired either. Returning back to my biggest achievement, yet also my worst nightmare, Casino Park, was an experience that went very similar to Team Dark, I won't lie. The roulette table again is unskippable, so therefore we are picking up 20 rings in this stage, but the actual pinball tables themselves I found myself having a lot less trouble with this time despite the size of Big the Cat. I thought this was going to be a bit more challenging trying to manoeuvre big around these unescapable rings and neon signs that grant you rings, but surprisingly wasn't that bad. But regardless, we finished the stage with 20 rings, which again is only just from the roulette table. It is a bit upsetting, but what can you do? My next worst nightmare, Bingo Highway, was also not as bad as expected. Of course, we start on the same pinball table as the last story, where we start with a massive line of rings to avoid, which surprisingly we got around quite easily, and then we have to get down the rest of the table without destroying any neon signs or picking up a giant box. But this section I was only stuck on for at least 2 or 3 minutes. It went surprisingly well, as Big the Cat killed himself at the start of the stage, and Amy and Cream being small enough to weave between the rings was not a problem at all. The rest of the stage went on just fine. The other pinball tables weren't too offensive. We was able to pull off the same trick of getting our other party members stuck on these bouncing little prongs or whatever they are, so that they didn't have to join the table with us, and Cream could just go off and venture the tables on her own. Bingo Highway was stress free, and we didn't have to go to the tunnel at the end of the stage either. That forces us to collect rings, so therefore we have our first Bingo Highway with 0 rings. Hallelujah. Robot Carnival continues the trend of making me sad by spawning us on top of a ring, but the rest of the fight itself isn't bad at all, and I even had less trouble even accidentally picking rings up this time, so yeah, 1 ring and a broken heart. Sweet Sweet Rail Canyon, much like the other stories, didn't cause me any problems here. A couple of buggy deaths here and there, but that's only my own fault for trying to take some skips here and there. But beside that, Rail Canyon, again, not a problem for this challenge. Rings are easily avoidable, and the stage being cut in half as well. There's so much less opportunity to collect rings in areas where it felt a lot harder to avoid. So yeah, Rail Canyon, more than possible with 0 rings. Bullet Station, again, was not my friend. The rest of the stage is perfectly fine, apart from these sections with the cannons. Now, thankfully, Team Rose's version only has 1 of these scripted sequences, and during this sequence we are forced into collecting 20 rings. No matter who we enter these cannons as, we're always picking up 20 rings. And while that is a big shame, it is what it is, unfortunately. So Bullet Station in Team Rose's story was finishable with 20 rings at a minimum. Now, if you want this game to be any more confusing, Team Rose Egg Albatross does not spawn you on top of a ring. It in fact spawns you in the middle of these rings. Why does it do that? I have no idea, but it makes them avoidable, and all my problems have been laid to rest. Egg Albatross is finally beatable without picking a ring up. Frog Forest once again served as a euphoric break from all the action, and we can just speed through this stage as you would on a normal playthrough. There are very little rings on the footpath that pose any threat of even being picked up, let alone any unscripted sequences. Everything is totally avoidable, and the stage is a good time as it was designed to be. Frog Forest is doable without picking a ring up. Moving on to Lost Jungle, a stage that caused me issue with Team Sonic but not Team Dark. I decided to learn from my replay and use the same strategies I used in Team Dark's playthrough to get through the stage without collecting rings. That mainly came from this scripted sequence with the vines. You don't have to take the final vine in this story, you can completely bypass it and then just make a very well timed jump to make a skip happen where you jump out of the flight animation and get an extra little bit of height from it so that it's possible to clear this gap. After that, the stage is more than doable, it's super easy, and we finish Lost Jungle with 0 rings. Now, as I said earlier when it came to the team battles, if you're fighting Team Chaotix, you're probably going to pick a ring up, and guess what? We pick a ring up. I don't know why it's like this for certain fights in this campaign, but for whatever reason, we have to pick a ring up against Team Chaotix, but we didn't have to pick rings up against Team Sonic. So, Team Chaotix, unfortunately, we have to pick a ring up, but it's all well and good because it's only 1 ring. Hang Castle was a ridiculously easy time, and I can't stress that enough. Hardly any rings in the stage as it is, and those that are in the stage are very avoidable. The ring bubbles aren't laid in the path whatsoever, and you can get through the stage without having to perform any sort of skip like we had to in the other stories. The only time that I had any sort of issue was at the end of the stage when I accidentally died because I tried to do something stupid, and I just didn't get on with the level as normal. But again, that was a stupid minor inconvenience of a death. Hang Castle is possible without collecting a ring. Mystic Mansion, I feared it would be more like the other stories where we would have had to collect a lot of rings. However, that's when I remember Team Rose has shorter levels and we have nothing to worry about because we don't enter the trippy room. The closest we get to being forced into collecting rings is on the bobsleigh section, where we're forced to collect 10 rings from this first balloon during the introductory section to this bobsleigh. We still have to make frame perfect jumps across the other rings like in the other stories, but beside that, Mystic Mansion is an absolute cakewalk, and we finished that one with 10 rings. Yada yada yada, Robot Storm is just like the other stories where you have to collect a ring at the start, and therefore it's impossible to finish without 0 rings, but it's more than possible to finish with 1. Here we go, Egg Fleet. Once again starting with the same issue as the other stories, we are forced to collect 4 rings in the beginning of the stage after we exit the ship. I was expecting this, so I wasn't too down by it. The rest of the stage, however, is quite easy. It just requires a little bit of careful manoeuvring on some of the fans where there's rings in the way, but beside that, Egg Fleet, just like in the other stories, is possible with only collecting 4 rings. Again, it is a downer, but we've got to take what we can get. Final Fortress, where journey meets its end. Much like the other stories, again doesn't pose much of a problem to the player. This is one of Team Rose's shorter stages and easier stages, which is quite surprising considering it's the final stage. There's not many rings lying about on the stage apart from on the rails where they blend in, so you just need to be aware of where they are and jump over them. But beside that, the combat's easy. There's nothing, like I said, that forces you to collect any rings. And before you know it, you're on the way to the goal ring after this final grinding section. You're not going to get caught in the way of any rings or rainbow rings because they're easily avoidable. Final Fortress, is finishable with 0 rings. Home stretch now, Egg Emperor is identical to that of the other stories in that you just avoid the rings at the start of the stage, yada yada, you chase him down, you go to the arena, smack the shit out of him, spam the homing attack, spam the team blast, spam the thunder shoot, anything that you can do to take him down, it really isn't a big problem. And of course, that means Egg Emperor is finishable without collecting a ring, and Team Rose's story comes to a close. Alrighty then, with all that said and done, that was a relatively short playthrough as to be expected. However, I expected it to be a lot more difficult in terms of the rings. Considering this is easy mode, you'd think they'd be dishing out rings left, right and centre, but as a matter of fact they're not. And we finish with 66 rings, which is 100 less than both of the other respective stories, which is quite the difference. And that is mainly from the stages being shorter, because scripted sequences that give us the rings, such as, you know, Bullet Station's Cannon, or just the general tables of Casino Park, being the roulette table and whatnot, those extra rings are awarded for absolutely no reason, essentially. Just the stages are longer in the other stories, and that's why so much more is given. There's more time to collect rings. That is simply it. You remove half the fat of the playthrough and you collect 100 less rings. It's as simple as that. So currently Team Rose leads with 66 rings. Now as far as Team Chaotix are going to go, well, there's missions that require you to collect rings, and an absurd amount of them at that. So I already know they're going to be the most. However, if I can find any glitches to get around it, I will. But as far as that goes, that's Team Rose's story. Is it possible without rings? No. But it's possible with less than 100 if that's any consolation.